I'm Eva Moreno, and when I was 23, my family erased me over a video I didn't even know existed. They said I shamed their name. But last week, a federal judge stood up in court and asked, "Wait, is that Governor Moreno?" The laughter was loud that evening, echoing through the Moreno household like a celebration for royalty. Strings of golden lights draped across the porch, and a banner hung proudly over the fireplace. "Congratulations, Sophia, our pride." It was a party thrown in honor of my sister's appointment as state prosecutor. The guest list was long: politicians, church friends, old colleagues from my father's police days. Everyone was there, everyone, except me. I stood across the street for a few minutes, just watching. Through the window, I saw my mother clink her wine glass with my sister's. My father's voice boomed with pride. "Sophia is the embodiment of this family's values." He always said things like that, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough to remind me that I wasn't. My name is Eva Moreno. I'm 23, a sociology graduate, an artist, and according to my family, a disappointment. I read Audre Lorde while they quoted scripture. I painted in silence while they debated politics. My world was made of canvases and journals. Theirs was black and white authority. I didn't belong at that table. And truthfully, I stopped trying 2 years ago. But none of that compared to what came next. It was a Monday when I got the message. A video intimate, stolen, posted online. Footage from spring break, taken without my consent by a boy I'd once trusted. It spread quickly. No context, no explanation. Just my face, my body. Broadcast for strangers to dissect. My sister found it first. That's what I was told later. She forwarded it straight to my father with one line: "Handle this before it goes public." Not to protect me, but to preserve the Moreno name. That night, I didn't eat dinner. My father burst into my room, fury in every movement. "You think we raised you for this?" he shouted. "To be paraded around like trash." He tossed my degree on the bed like a failed report card. "You want to shame this family. Do it without our name, our house, our help." I turned to my mother, rosary clenched in her fingers. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom," I whispered. She said nothing. My sister stood behind them, arms crossed, eyes cold. There was no protest, no mercy. I packed in silence. Sketchbooks, a few clothes, the red backpack I'd had since freshman year. As I walked out, my father left my bank card on the table like a final transaction. "Don't call. Don't come back." Through the front window, I saw my mother watching, not waving, not crying, just watching. That's when I knew I hadn't just been kicked out. I had been erased. The night I left, I didn't cry. Not when the door shut behind me. Not when I stood alone on the street with nowhere to go. The grief didn't come as tears. It came as a cold, steady silence. A silence so complete it felt like being swallowed whole. I used what little money I had left to buy a one-way bus ticket north. I didn't choose Minneapolis because I knew someone there. I chose it because it sounded like the kind of place no one would look for me. On the bus, I sat near the back and stared out the window as the miles blurred past. I had no plan, no safety net, only the determination to never again let anyone decide who I was. The first few nights, I slept in the back of a friend's old Toyota, parked in a grocery store lot. That friend, a college acquaintance, let me stay for 3 days. On the 4th day, she apologized and said her boyfriend wasn't comfortable having me around. I thanked her anyway and didn't ask why. On the 7th night, I curled up beneath an overpass just outside the city. The wind whipped through my coat like it wasn't even there. I pulled out the leather-bound notebook I'd carried since I was 13. Inside were family recipes, birthday reminders, my mother's tiny love notes from when I was still her daughter. One by one, I tore the pages out and fed them to a small flame in a metal trash can. I didn't cry then either. Just watched the fire eat away at the last pieces of who I used to be. When the flames died down, I whispered to the dark, "If I'm no one to them, then I'll become someone to myself." I got a job waiting tables at a 24-hour diner on Nicollet Avenue. It paid just enough to keep me fed. A week later, I picked up a second job cleaning offices at night. I scrubbed bathrooms, emptied trash bins, and wiped down boardroom tables that would never seat someone like me. During the afternoons, I worked temp data entry, filling in spreadsheets with numbers I'd forget as soon as I left. I never told anyone my real name. I started signing paperwork as Reyes, not quite a lie, but not entirely me either. At first, it was just a way to disappear, but slowly, it became something else, a blank slate, a placeholder for whoever I would become. My room was a rented corner in a crumbling apartment building peeling paint, creaky floors, a broken heater that wheezed all winter. But it was mine. I slept on a second-hand mattress, kept a toothbrush and a half-empty bottle of shampoo by the sink, and taped old postcards to the wall to remind myself that the world was still bigger than this place. At night, when the noise from the other tenants died down, I wrote, not full thoughts, just fragments, scribbled in a code I made up as a child. Words I couldn't say out loud, pain I couldn't explain. I kept those pages hidden under my mattress, like confessions only I could read. Then came the scissors. It was a Tuesday, cold and gray. I stood in the cracked bathroom mirror and cut off my hair. No music, no drama. Just silence and the soft sound of scissors slicing through strands. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a decision, a ritual. Shedding the girl who had waited too long for someone else to see her. That night, during the graveyard shift at the medical clinic where I cleaned exam rooms, I heard raised voices in the hallway. A young mother, clinging to her child, stood trembling while a uniformed officer barked orders in Spanish. "Sign here," he growled, waving a document. She didn't understand, or maybe she did, but fear locked her in place. I stepped in before I had time to think. "She's not signing anything," I said, louder than I meant to. The officer turned, irritated. "Who the hell are you? She's not signing," I repeated. "Those forms are outdated. Legally, this isn't valid. It wasn't true." I barely knew what I was saying, but he hesitated, muttered something about calling his supervisor. Then he left. The woman didn't thank me. She just clutched her daughter tighter and cried into her jacket. Later that week, I was called into the director's office. I thought I was getting fired. Instead, I met Mara Vega, head of a nonprofit called New Passage, which helped undocumented families navigate the legal system. She looked at me like she already knew my story, even though I hadn't told her a word. "Most people wouldn't have stepped in," she said. "Most people have something to lose." I replied. She offered me a part-time position not as a janitor, but as a community liaison. My job was small translating forms, fetching coffee, making calls no one answered. But I showed up, I listened, I asked questions. I watched how advocacy worked, how laws became shields or weapons depending on who wielded them. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like someone beginning again quietly, invisibly, but with purpose, and that was enough to keep going. It started with translating intake forms and answering phones, but I stayed. I watched, I listened, and eventually, I learned that quiet persistence has a way of becoming undeniable. That was how I began to rebuild, not with noise, but with presence. I enrolled in online policy courses through a community college. At night, after my shifts at New Passage, I'd sit at my folding table with a borrowed laptop and study the structure of legislation, how language could either trap or free. Weekends, I'd audit local immigration law seminars when space allowed. I didn't know yet what I was becoming, only that I was moving forward and not just surviving anymore. I started attending public hearings quietly, always in the back. City council meetings, housing boards, local education task forces. I took notes obsessively, not because I was required to, but because I needed to understand how the gears turned, who held power, who didn't, and why the same people kept falling through the cracks. At New Passage, my role shifted gradually. I went from shadowing Mara Vega to drafting policy memos. I stopped waiting for permission and started offering suggestions. Small things at first, tweaks in outreach strategy, edits to community grant applications, but they were noticed. By the end of my second year, I was writing proposals solo. By the third, I was managing entire programs. I never allowed anyone to print my full name. When journalists reached out, I asked them to refer to me as E.M. Reyes. No headshots, no triumph over adversity profiles. I didn't want my story reduced to trauma, and I didn't want my face to be a symbol. Let the work speak. First, that was enough. Still, word got around. One day, I was invited to sit on the city's Immigrant Policy Advisory Council. I read the email 3 times before believing it was real. It wasn't glamorous. It came with no pay, no car service, just a seat at the table where decisions were made, and that, to me, was power. The first meeting was held in a wood-paneled municipal hall. A councilman in a Navy suit had been pushing for increased ICE cooperation in local shelters, citing efficiency. When it was my turn to speak, I leaned forward and said, calmly, if the law refuses to grow with justice, then justice stops being lawful and starts being ornamental. The room fell silent. A few people clapped. That night, someone from the Minneapolis Gazette emailed to request a profile. I replied with one line, only if you don't include a photo. They declined the interview. That was fine by me. I moved into a modest walk-up near Riverside Park. It wasn't much, but it was clean, warm, and quiet. The walls were bare except for one painting I had done, a woman walking alone in a field, her silhouette stretching too far behind her, warped by light. I named it Burden, but never hung it. I left it propped against the far corner, out of sight, but always there. The neighborhood began to know me by reputation. Parents whose children I helped find legal support brought me fruit, tamales, hand-sewn scarves. Old women pressed my hands and called me Mija. Men who once distrusted my presence nodded in quiet respect. I had become something I never expected to be necessary. But I wasn't seeking fame. I wasn't seeking redemption. I just wanted to build something useful from the ruin they left me in. Once, during a fundraising dinner for the organization, a prominent councilwoman leaned in and said, you could go far in politics. With your clarity, your discipline, you're a natural leader. I smiled politely. I'm already leading. I said. She laughed like I was being humble, but I wasn't. I had learned that leadership didn't always look like a podium or a press conference. Sometimes, it was sitting across from a frightened father and helping him find words in a language not his own. Sometimes, it was reviewing a city contract and catching the clause designed to exclude the very people it claimed to serve. Leadership, for me, wasn't about being seen. It was about making sure the unseen had someone watching out for them. And even though I hadn't spoken my family's names in years, I carried them in every silence I filled with action. I wasn't hiding anymore. I just didn't owe anyone my story, not yet. So I kept going. I kept working. I kept building a life that made no noise but left a mark. I never planned to return, not to that city, not to that name. I had spent too many years carving a life outside its shadow. But some stories have a way of circling back, not to ask for closure, but to test how far you've come without it. The headline broke on a rainy Friday morning. State Prosecutor Eva Moreno, under investigation for evidence tampering in high-profile deportation case. I blinked at the name. Not just hers. The mother at the center of the case was someone I knew. Someone I had once helped find emergency housing after fleeing cartel violence in Honduras. She had come into our office with hollow eyes and a child clinging to her coat like a lifeline. I had sat with her on a cracked bench for hours, translating, reassuring, building a path where there had only been fear. And now, the case that could destroy my sister's career was one I had touched, quietly, invisibly, years ago. My press team found out within hours. Phones rang off the hook. My chief of staff entered my office, voice taut. "We recommend you remain neutral," she said. "You're a sitting governor. Any public stance here could be interpreted as a conflict of interest." Another aide added, "It's not your fight. Let it play out." But I didn't see it that way. It wasn't about Sophia. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the ghost in that courtroom, ghost with my face, my story, and my silence. I booked a flight to St. Paul under a different name. No press release, no security entourage, just me, a plain black coat, and the resolve of someone who no longer owed anyone permission. The courthouse was colder than I remembered. White walls, metal detectors, fluorescent lights that flattened every expression into something clinical. I entered through the side and took a seat in the last row, where the shadows settled and no one would look twice. Sophia sat at the front, dressed like a statue, immaculate, expressionless, spine straight, the same posture she had worn all her life, like truth was a coat she could shrug on when convenient. But I noticed the tension in her fingers, the way she kept folding and unfolding the edge of a printed exhibit. My mother sat beside her, lips pale, rosary wound tight around both hands. My father, still tall, still rigid, stared forward like a man watching a building collapse and trying to count the floors on the way down. Then Judge Marin Booker entered the chamber. I remembered her. We had once sat together on a policy panel for criminal justice reform. She was sharp, unflinching, never forgot a name. She scanned the room as she always did, measuring every presence like a scale. Her eyes landed on mine. She paused. Then wait. Is that Governor Eva Reyes' silence fell like a dropped gavel. Every head turned, cameras tilted, journalists whispered into phones. Sophia's posture fractured. Her head jerked toward the gallery. Her eyes met mine, confused, wide, and suddenly very, very small. My mother's lips parted in disbelief. My father leaned forward slightly, squinting like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Like I was a ghost made of headlines and regret. I didn't wave. I didn't nod. I just sat, spine straight, face still, as if my presence alone was enough to rewrite everything they thought they knew. The judge cleared her throat, composed herself, and resumed the proceedings. But the air never quite settled after that. People kept glancing back. The courtroom, once hers, now belonged to the one she had erased. I didn't come to speak. I didn't come to interfere. I came to witness. When the session adjourned, I slipped out the same way I entered. No words exchanged, no cameras in my face, just the echo of my footsteps in the marble hall. Back at the hotel, my phone was already buzzing, missed calls, news alerts, mentions. My name trending not for scandal this time, but for presence. And as I stood by the window, watching the city that once spat me out, try to remember how to pronounce my name, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something quieter, like gravity realigning, like a story no longer bending to someone else's ending. The next morning, headlines still whispered my name, but I had already closed the curtain. What I'd come to do, sit in that courtroom and be seen without needing to speak, was done. I had no plans to linger. But some ghosts don't knock before re-entering your life. They arrive through phone screens, trembling voices, and silences too long to ignore. The first message came from my mother. A call at 7:42 a.m. I didn't answer. Then a voicemail, soft breathing, a choked Eva. Please, just come home. Just once. That word home hung in the air like smoke. By noon, a text from my father followed. 4 words. We need to talk. I didn't reply. That night, my cousin Lena called. We hadn't spoken in years, but her voice was urgent and quiet. Your mom's blood pressure spiked. They admitted her. It's not serious yet. But she keeps asking for you. I hesitated. Everything in me wanted to stay in Colorado, to let the silence hold. But something, perhaps not love, but unfinished history, pulled me back. I arrived in St. Paul 2 nights later. The house looked smaller. The porch, once imposing, now sagged slightly at the corners. I stood at the front steps with my coat buttoned to the neck, hands steady, heart not. My mother opened the door. She looked older, smaller than I remembered. Her smile trembled, mascara smudged at the corners like shadows that didn't want to let go. "Eva," she whispered. I didn't respond, just stepped inside. The dining room was set like it had been in the old days, too polished, too performative. Candles flickered, plates were laid out with mathematical precision. The same chair I used to sit in had been reupholstered new leather. Fresh stitching, but underneath I could still feel the splintered wood from before. It was symbolic. Somehow the same broken frame dressed in a shinier skin. My father stood at the head of the table, arms stiff at his sides. Sophia sat across from my seat, her head bowed, lips pressed into a thin line. She looked nothing like the woman from the courtroom. Just a sister now small, quiet, undone. Dinner was served. Enchiladas, roasted corn, fresh tortillas, and a wine no one touched. They tried to fill the air with stories. "Remember when you used to draw on napkins at the table?" my mother asked, voice overly bright, fragile. "I read one of your speeches." My father said, "Very professional." I nodded. I didn't thank them. I didn't pretend. Eventually, Sophia spoke. Her voice cracked, low and sincere. "I know I messed up. I never thought it would go this far." And then it came. My mother's hand reached for mine, but stopped just short. "Maybe you could say a few words to the prosecutor." She said, "Nothing formal, just help. For family." That word again. I placed my fork down gently. The sound it made, just a click, felt louder than any shout. "If I weren't the governor," I asked, "would I still be your blood silence?" No one answered. Not a word. Not a blink. That silence was the truest thing they'd ever said to me. I stood. The air felt thinner the moment I left my seat. "I kept your name," I said softly, "but I built my life without you in it." My father flinched barely, but I saw it. I walked toward the door. My coat brushed my calves like a curtain falling at the end of a play. "Eva, please," my mother called behind me, voice cracking. But I didn't turn around. I stepped outside. The air was crisp and dry, the way it always was in late autumn. The trees were nearly bare. The porch light flickered above me. And for the first time since I was 19, I walked away, not as the girl they abandoned, but as the woman they could no longer define. Not by their expectations, not by their shame, and definitely not by their need. The silence I carried out of that house wasn't empty, it was full. Full of every moment I had waited for an apology that never came, for a gesture that never arrived, but I didn't need it anymore. Their absence in my life had stopped being a wound. It had become a boundary, one I chose to keep. Back in Minnesota, I did not take time to reflect. I went straight to work. 3 days later, standing before my legislative team, I introduced the draft for a new bill, the Familial Witness Protection Act. Its purpose was simple: to protect whistleblowers, civil servants, and public officials from being threatened, coerced, or discredited by family members or personal connections seeking to suppress the truth. Not through brute force, but through guilt, legacy, obligation, or shame. Everyone in the room understood without asking. This wasn't about one woman's family. It was about the unspoken epidemic of loyalty being used as a weapon. It was about the daughters and sons who were punished not for lying, but for refusing to stay quiet. It was about ending the idea that protecting truth meant betraying blood. The media reaction was immediate and different this time. They didn't call me the estranged sister of a disgraced prosecutor. They called me a reformer, a survivor, a leader who had turned a wound into law. I gave no personal interviews. I refused to tell the full story, not because I was hiding, but because I finally understood what mattered was not where the bill came from, but who it would reach. The day the bill passed committee, I received a message at the office. No sender listed, just a handwritten note delivered in an envelope. We grew up in the same house, but you built something I could never touch. S. It was the first time Sophia had reached out since I walked away from that dinner. The handwriting was hers tight, slanted slightly to the right, like it always was when she was nervous. I didn't respond. Instead, I left the note on my desk and went to prepare for the National Summit on Family Justice Reform. The room was quiet as I stepped on stage. No dramatic lighting, no orchestras, just a crowd of people who had carried silence for too long, whistleblowers from corporations, public institutions, and most painfully, from families. I spoke simply. I was once called a disgrace. Then I was erased. Then I was threatened not with violence, but with memory, with reminders of who I was supposed to be. I'm not here to make anyone apologize to me. I'm here so that the next generation doesn't have to choose between truth and belonging. Because if truth costs us our place at the table, then it was never a table, it was a trap. The room held its breath, not with applause, not with noise, but with the heavy stillness of something real being named. I ended the speech by introducing the Public Kinship Clause, a policy allowing civil employees to declare familial relationships that might affect their public roles without facing retaliation or being branded disloyal. Transparency, not shame. Truth, not betrayal. Later that evening, I stepped off the stage alone. No photographers waited. No flowers were handed to me. Just the feeling that something had quietly, permanently shifted. That night, I returned to my apartment. No guards, no staff. I brewed tea, turned off my phone, and lit the candle I kept on my windowsill. Then the intercom buzzed. The voice downstairs was faint but unmistakable. It's Sophia. I don't need anything. I hoped I could say something in person. I pressed the door open, not as an invitation, as a gesture. She entered the office 10 minutes later. No makeup, hair pulled back, wearing jeans and a blouse that had seen better days. She looked around like a stranger stepping into a memory she didn't know how to hold. I didn't stand. She sat across from me, took a deep breath, and began. I don't want anything. I'm not here for favors. I just needed to say this. I spent years stepping on you, not because you were weak, but because you reminded me of everything I wasn't strong enough to be. I see that now. Her voice cracked. But she kept going. I ruined what we could have had as sisters. Not because I hated you, but because I envied the fact that you didn't need us the way we needed to be needed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't cry. She looked down at her hands. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I exhaled, soft and even. You're right. You don't. Her eyes filled, but she didn't argue. I leaned forward slightly. But you also don't need it. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. And I haven't forgotten. She nodded, slowly, then stood to leave. As she reached for her bag, her hand brushed against a folded piece of paper near the edge of my desk. She paused. It was a copy of a letter I had once written but never sent, a letter of character defense I had drafted weeks earlier, when I wasn't sure whether I'd help her or not. I let it sit there, unsigned. She didn't ask about it, and I didn't explain. We exchanged no goodbyes, only silence. The next day, I walked into the State House to vote on a housing equity bill. As I passed through the lobby, a janitor I had known for years gave me a quiet nod. You look taller today, he said. I smiled. I stopped carrying what didn't belong to me. He chuckled and kept mopping, and I kept walking into the chamber, into the next bill, into the life I had built on my own terms. I no longer need to be seen to know I exist. I no longer wait at doors that once shut behind me, hoping they'll open with grace. My worth was never meant to fit inside someone else's idea of loyalty. My dignity was never theirs to define, and never theirs to reclaim. Some things don't require closure. Some wounds don't heal with apologies. They close because we choose to stop bleeding for people who never learned how to hold us gently. And as I stand alone, upright, unshaken at the edge of the chamber, I reach for the door, press it open, and step forward. Not to prove anything, only because it is mine to walk through. True worth does not ask to be recognized, and dignity once claimed cannot be taken.